Good evening, I'm Patrice Tedisco from the Freedom's Way National Heritage Area. I'd like to welcome you here this evening for declaring independence then and now. Standing on my tiptoes, so I don't wobble too much. First, I'd like to thank our partners this evening. We have students from the Westford schools, which is a first for us, so we're very excited about that. The First Parish United Church of Westford and the Westford Historical Society, as well, for partnering with us on this program. I've been asked to tell you that after the performance there'll be refreshments downstairs, where there will be a copy of the Declaration of Independence that I believe is owned by the town. I don't know if it's held here in trust at the church, so please take a look at that. And there'll also be a facilitated discussion with Pastor Eric Hausman. Freedom's Way is one of 49 national heritage areas throughout the United States. It's a program that's managed in partnership with the National Park Service. And national heritage areas are distinct regions of the country that tell a unique national story. We're very fortunate in Massachusetts because we have 5 national heritage areas here in our very small state. So do the math. And then think about, what a wonderful thing that is and how that attests to our history, nature, and culture. Our National Heritage Area is partnered with Minuteman National Historical Park. And our story, one of the many stories in the Heritage Area, is centered around the American Revolution. Declaring Independence Then and Now is a program that we developed in partnership with the American Antiquarian Society, and it grew out of work that the organization was doing under the guidance of historian Mary Fuhrer, who's here this evening, to work with communities and citizen historians to research the words that were spoken, the true words that were spoken by citizens in these communities in the period before, during, and after the Revolution. One of the wonderful byproducts of the program is that it's opened up a whole new way of looking, at least for me and the folks that have been engaged in the program, in how the Declaration was created. It wasn't a slam dunk. It was something that really took a lot of time and thought, and it also is a really great indicator of one of the themes of our heritage area, which really is about the American democratic process. So this evening, I hope you enjoy Declaring Independence Then and Now. If you have an opportunity, there'll still be some other performances this year, and you can see it in other venues. We work very hard in partnership with these communities to host this event in historic sites, such as this beautiful building in which the Declaration was actually read and debated. So every space is different. Every conversation is different, and at the end of the day, we really feel very strongly that it's an important indicator of the truths that this document holds. Thank you.
The Declaration of Independence is revolutionary. It was in 1776, and it remains so today, as it boldly professes what is and what could be. The Declaration announced the birth of a nation, one governed by and for the people, in order to secure liberty, equality, and justice for all. For over 200 years, we have been engaged in a struggle to redeem these revolutionary promises. Today, the Declaration remains a remarkable document of what we, as a nation, must continually strive to become. Now, when we hear some of the words today, it might sound so, of course we want liberty and equality. They sound like we take them for granted. But both those principles and who they apply to are not to be taken for granted. And also the very act of declaring independence from Great Britain was not always the right decision for everyone. The minister at this congregation, so I'm the pastor here, and my predecessor, the Reverend William Hall, he was a Tory. He was against the revolution. He was not a popular minister at those times. For the record, I'm for independence. So it's not something to take for granted, and it is worth revisiting this document with its history, reminding us of where we have been and where we are headed. Now, many played a part in birthing the Declaration. In the spring of '76, when the Continental Congress considered independence from Great Britain, it wanted assurances that each colony would support this risky endeavor. The colonies responded with the language of independence, language they had heard over the previous 10 years of popular protest. In Massachusetts, John Adams, right over here, declared, along with the legislature, in these following words:
Essex Journal, May 18, 1776. Resolved as the opinion of this House that the inhabitants of each town in this colony ought, in full meeting, advise whether that if the Honorable Congress should, for the safety of said colonies, declare them independent of the Kingdom of Great Britain, they, the said inhabitants, will solemnly engage with their lives and their fortunes to support them in this measure.
Across Massachusetts, people gathered in town meetings to debate the question. Each knew the meaning of engaging with their lives and fortunes. If they tried and failed to separate from Britain, they would face the penalties of treason, their property seized, their lives forfeited. Today, the results of their debates and votes survive in town meeting record books. Some towns simply affirmed their support. Others drafted full-fledged letters of independence and support. And some, like Barnstable, whose coastline lay exposed to the world's most powerful navy, voted not to seek independence. Surprising. Let us recover the words of those people in 1776.
As an aside, just let me tell you that you are sitting in Westford's third meeting house, which was built in the early 1790s, shortly after the second meeting house burned down. And in that second meeting house, which was not only the church, but the center of the town government, we saw that on June 14th, 1776, they said, "It is our humble opinion that nothing short of a state of independency will so well answer for our safety, and in case the said Congress should declare a state of independency, we will acquiesce thereto and risk our lives and fortunes in support thereof."
In the town of Warwick, where the minister preached strenuously against independence, the town voted by yeas and nays. 38 names voted yea, and 44 came in within 6 days and voted for independence, meaning a total of 82 yeas and not one nay. Sudbury Town Meeting, June 10, 1776. The present unhappy situation of our public affairs, by reason of the arbitrary and oppressive measures taken against us in the American colonies by the King and Parliament of Great Britain, and all hopes of a combination seem to be finally at an end. We therefore give the strongest assurance that it is not only the unanimous, but the hearty and sincere intention of your constituents that should the Honorable Continental Congress for the safety of these colonies declare them independent of Great Britain, they will, at the risk of their all, support them in the measures.
June ye 14th, 1776, at a general town meeting, Acton. The subverting of our Constitution, the many injuries and unheard of barbarities which these colonies have received from Great Britain, confirms in the opinion that the present age will be deficient in their duty to God and posterity, and themselves if they do not establish an American Republic. We give them the strongest assurance that if they should declare America to be a free and independent republic, your constituents will support and defend the measure with their lives and their fortune.
In Sudbury and Acton's responses, we see more than mere assent. In asserting their rights and grievances, they were following a model. The British people had a long tradition of respecting lawful authority. If a ruler was to be ousted and a new government instituted, the reasons must be properly stated and declared. Now, there are several elements it should include, and it should announce an important change in government. It should lay out the people's rights and show how those rights had been violated. It should declare that as a result of these violations, the ruler had broken his contract with the people and thereby abdicating their authority. Finally, it should also announce the creation of a new government.
Malden, a Declaration of Independence, May 17, 1776. It is the ardent wish of our souls that America become a free and independent state. A sense of unprovoked injuries will arouse the resentment of the most people. Such injuries these colonies have received from Great Britain. Unjustifiable claims have been made by the king and his minions to tax us without consent. These claims have been prosecuted in a manner cruel and unjust to the highest degree. They sent fleets and armies to America that have deprived us of our trade, cutting the throats of our brethren. They have awed us into submission and erected a position in America that which so far enlarged the influence of the crown as it enables to rivet their shackles upon the people of Great Britain. For these reasons, we are confirmed in the opinion that the present age will be defiant of the duties of God, their posterity, and themselves if they do not establish an American republic.
More than 3/4 of Massachusetts towns drafted statements on independency that spring, almost all of them positive. Crafting, debating, and voting on these statements solidified support and mobilized towns. It primed people for the Declaration of Independence. When the Continental Congress ultimately declared independence, word traveled fast. By July 14th, an express rider carrying the Declaration reached Worcester, where Isaiah Thomas jumped out and waylaid him. The activist and printer took the document to the steps of the meeting house and proclaimed it to the assembled crowds before allowing the rider to continue on his journey. This marked the first time those memorable words were heard in Massachusetts. Public celebrations ensued.
Massachusetts Spy, Worcester, July 24th. On Monday last, a number of patriotic gentlemen of this town assembled on the green near the Liberty Pole, where the bells were set a-ringing and the drums a-beating, after which the Declaration of Independence of the United States was read to a large and respectable body, who testified their approbation by repeated huzzas, firing of musketry and cannon, bonfires, and other demonstrations of joy. The Sons of Freedom repaired to the tavern, where toasts were drunk, including perpetual itching without the benefit of scratching to the enemies of America.
In Boston, one of the Sons of Liberty read the Declaration from the old State House balcony to jubilant crowds below. Then the legislature ordered the document be proclaimed in every village and every town.
In Council, July 17, 1776, ordered that the Declaration of Independence be printed, a copy sent to the ministers of each parish within the state, and that they be required to read the same to their respective congregations, and to deliver it to the clerks of the town, who are hereby required to record the same in their town books, there to remain as perpetual memorials thereof.
When they heard that declaration proclaimed in their towns, July 1776, the people recognized the words as their own, the grievances expressed as trials they had experienced, the liberties asserted as their own birthright. Hear that Declaration of Independence now, as it was heard proclaimed to Massachusetts townsfolk 240 years ago. It begins with announcing a great change in government. The reasons for this change must be clearly set forth for all colonists, British, and the whole world to understand.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them the separation.
Then, in a most memorable passage, the Declaration asserts the equality and universal right to liberty of all the people and the responsibility of government to ensure these rights. The term all the people was not as inclusive those days as we might hope for, and even the term used today might not carry the meanings that we want to extend. And yet, the asserting of these values and claims of equality and universal right to liberty, they're foundational for everything that follows. Everything else in the Declaration flows from these extraordinary claims.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the rights of the people to alter or to abolish it, and is to institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and their happiness.
The Declaration then professes the colonists' respect for established laws. However, those laws have been so repeatedly violated that to continue under current government would amount to surrendering to tyranny.
Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience has shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such now is the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government.
The longest part of the Declaration details the people's grievances, for it is these grievances that justify the overthrow of authority. This train of abuses that the king has repeatedly and purposely harmed his colonists is proof that he has become a tyrant and is no longer fit to be the guardian of their liberty and equality.
The history of the present King of Great Britain is the history of repeated injuries and usurpations. All have in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
Then we hear 29 general grievances against king, parliament, and the British people. They begin with actions taken by the king to obstruct, delay, and negate colonial government, undermining the sovereignty of the people.
He has refused to assent his laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. He, when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them.
They protest that the king, fearing large legislative bodies, had refused to allocate representatives to the growing frontier, denying settlers their rightful voice in government.
He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people will relinquish the right of representative in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only.
They protest punitive acts by king and parliament that hampered the meetings and business of colonial legislatures, again denying the people their rightful participation in government.
He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual and uncomfortable, in distance from the depository of their records, for the sole purpose of fatiguing men into compliance with these measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions of the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, after such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining, in the meantime, exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions from within.
All of these above grievances point to one end. The king was obstructing the rule of law in order to silence the voice and the will of the people. And so this list of grievances continued. The king had banned settlement on the Ohio River, limiting westward migration of the colonists, and in their minds, the right to secure their subsistence on new lands. He was thus obstructing prosperity and denying their very pursuit of happiness.
He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for the purpose of obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriation of lands.
The king interfered with American courts of justice and diverted them from established rule of law in the pursuit of the common good.
He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries.
The king appointed despised tax collectors and the customs agents to police American trade and to not look after the economic welfare of the people.
He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out our substance.
He had sent his army to harass and intimidate them.
He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power.
He allowed Parliament to impose laws upon colonists, though the colonists had no representatives in Parliament, that undermined the sovereignty of the people in the colonies themselves.
He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledgeable by our laws, giving his assent to the acts of pretended legislation.
Parliament punished their protests with a series of intolerable acts. These violated their treasured rights as British citizens.
For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by mock trial from punishment of murders which they should commit if the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefit of trial by jury, for transferring transporting us beyond seas to be tried in pretend offenses.
Parliament allowed French law and Catholic religion to persist in Quebec after it became an English colony. This and other acts the colonists believed threatened their prized English constitutional law and Protestant religion and identity.
For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies.
And perhaps most grievously, the colonies believed that king and parliament together conspired to strip them of their prized right of self-governance. Constitutions were voided, laws abolished, even town meetings were banned.
Taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments. We're suspending our own legislators and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever.
By these abuses, the king had abandoned his role as their sovereign protector. He had become their enemy, at war with his very own people.
He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is, at this time, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation.
In that war, they asserted, the king was impressing American sailors into the British Navy and inciting Native Americans to attack the frontiers. Trigger warning. The racist language that follows is harsh and stands as an example that racism is not a new problem in our country, but woven into the very fabric of our nation and culture. Though harsh on our ears and hearts, it is true in history.
He has constrained our fellow citizens taken captive on the high seas to bear arms against their country, to become executioners of their friends and brethren, and to fall themselves by their hand. He has excited domestic insurrection amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
The king ignored all their appeals for justice. Therefore, he forfeited his place as ruler and left them a people ungoverned.
In every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for readdress in the most humblest terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injuries. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be a ruler of a free people.
The British people, too, once held in warm brotherly affection, abandoned them to the abuses of king and parliament. In grief, the colonists must separate from their ancestral king.
Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our emigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must therefore acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them, as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace, friends.
Being then without a governor or government, it is necessary for these colonies to establish a new government with all the powers of governments among all the nations of the world.
We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do.
Finally, the people declare that to this new government they pledge their all, including all that will be lost if their cause fails: their lives, their property, and their honor among their descendants.
And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
These words were proclaimed from pulpits. They were printed in broadsides, toasted in taverns. They responded to deeply felt grievances. They professed deeply held rights. They inspired people to risk their all to create a new nation, a nation dedicated to liberty and equality. For 240 years now, we've been wrestling with these questions. We've been wrestling with these values, striving for these kinds of liberties and equality. The challenges are still with us. It's not so easy to secure liberty, ensure equality before the law and for all. The Declaration is itself a living document. It draws its vitality from each generation's pursuit of liberty and equality. And so, what of our generation today? Who is all the people? Whose rights are the ones worth fighting for? Is equal justice ensured across races, across religious creeds? Do all have an equal voice and equal power of representation? What does equality mean in a society divided by class and wealth? Does poverty jeopardize liberty? Does liberty imply essential rights to health, education, and welfare? If we see our government falling short of ensuring liberty and equality, what redress do we have for our grievances, and how do we exercise that? We all are heirs of this obligation to redeem the promises of the Declaration of Independence. How are we doing? Okay, I'm going to transition now from rhetorical questions to real questions. First of all, thank you for your time and attention. We segue now from the rhetorical questions to real ones, and we invite a public conversation. A public conversation on the continued relevance and challenges of this document and our lives today. We invite free speech and also respect and care. Civil discourse can be so delicate. Let us hold this conversation and care for our nation and for each other as we explore this living document and our journey together with it. Thank you so much for everyone who coordinated this, especially the